Hi everyone! In this video we are going to discuss proteins, but more specifically we're going to actually break them down and talk about their composition. And so hopefully by the end of the video you will have a very good idea of what a polypeptide is and what amino acid is. So those are the two big components that we want to know here. So the first thing I want to do is define what a protein actually is. So if we write this out here, a protein is essentially a polymer that is built from what are called amino acids, and we're going to say monomers. So we've discussed this word before, but a monomer is essentially just the smallest repeating unit in a polymer. So a polymer, remember, is a big, long chain. It's all strung together. And then the monomer is just the one little piece that keeps repeating. So you can just chop it up into little pieces. So we talked about these things before, specifically when we were discussing our sugars and we discussed our mono and our polysaccharides. Okay, so hopefully this is kind of coming back together. Now we also need to discuss what an amino acid is. So an amino acid is something that's very specific. So let's write this out here. So an amino acid. This is a molecule with a central carbon atom. And then there's four things that it is definitely have to be attached to every single time. Okay, there's no exceptions to this. First things first is it must have a carboxylic acid. Carboxylic acid. So we've talked about this a lot. That's your RCOOH. That's our shorthand of that functional group. But hopefully we also know by now that we can draw this out like this, a carbon, double bond to an oxygen, and then that's attached to what we refer to as an alcohol. As a group, that's called a carboxylic acid. All right, the second component of an amino acid, so the carboxylic acid gave you the acid part. Now we're going to talk about the amino part, or the amine. So it has to have an amine group. So your amine group, that's AMINE, okay, an amine group is just, you always have an R, okay, so remember that R is your generic component. The amine group is a nitrogen that's connected to two hydrogens, okay? So usually when we draw this one out, we say R is attached to nitrogen, here's your lone pairs, and then it has a hydrogen and a hydrogen. So it has that trigonal pyramidal structure, looks very much like ammonia, but that R could be anything. It could be carbons, it could be just a very generic chain, it could potentially be just a hydrogen. Usually it's not, though, in an amino acid. All right, so we have a carboxylic, we have an amine group, we also have to have an hydrogen atom. Probably should say a hydrogen atom. Sometimes we refer to this as a proton, okay? So if you ever hear someone talk about the proton in an amino acid, we're talking about the hydrogen. So that's just an H, right? I don't need to draw that out for you. And then the last component is we have some kind of side chain, a generic side chain. And we already know this notation, but people refer to it usually as R. Okay, so let's put this all together and draw out a very generic amino acid. So we said we have a carbon central atom. Then it has to be attached to a carboxylic acid. That's number one. So here's your carbon. It's attached to your oxygen, which is attached to your alcohol. So this right here is group 1, that's your carboxylic acid. Now back to your central atom, it has to be attached to an amine group, that's number 2. So here's your nitrogen with your 2 hydrogens on it. So right there, that's group 2. It also has to be attached to a hydrogen. So the carbon's right there, there's your hydrogen, that's group 3. And then the last thing is it has to have that generic side chain. So there's your R, that's group 4. What we've drawn out here is a very generic, classic example of an amino acid. You must know what this looks like. You must know the generic structure, you need to know the definition of an amino acid, and you need to be able to draw that out right there, okay? Now just so you know, there are 20 naturally occurring amino acids. Okay? You are expected to memorize all 20 of those and know all 20 structures. I'm just kidding. That would be terrible. That's a biology class. You absolutely do not need to know that. All you need to know for this course is that there are 20 natural occurring amino acids and know the generic structure. Okay? That's all I expect you to know. I was totally kidding. You don't have to memorize that. All right, now moving on. Now, we said earlier that we want to figure out what a polypeptide is. Let's start off with a simple one and talk about a dipeptide. Okay? Dipeptide. A dipeptide is essentially a molecule with two amino acids, okay, two peptides. 2 amino acids. So how do we create this? Well, usually dipeptides are created with what are called condensation reactions. Condensation reactions. So this should be familiar. This is the third time we've talked about it. So what you do is you take 2 amino acids, okay? They don't have to be the same thing, but they could be the same thing. And then you convert them into what is called a dipeptide. 2 amino acids. Now, in order for this to be a condensation reaction, you have to eliminate one product. What is the identity of that product? Go. All right, did you get an answer? Hopefully you did. We've definitely discussed condensation reactions before. So by definition, in order for something to be called a condensation reaction, you must have water as a product, okay? So the correct answer was water. Hopefully you got that right. So that's how you make a dipeptide. You take one amino acid, treat it with another amino acid, creating a dipeptide and eliminating water. Now a polypeptide, okay, is just the polymer version of a dipeptide. So essentially it's a very, very big molecule with a string of amino acids. But the big thing that I can stress here or really illustrate, and I want to get through your head, I guess I should say, is that the order is crucial. It is very, very, very important because we have a string of amino acids that are built up in a specific order to create a very unique polypeptide. If you move, let's say we have a polymer or a polypeptide that has 20 amino acids. If we move amino acids 17 and 18 and just switch them around, you've created a completely different polypeptide. So the order that it is built in is very, very important. And so let me kind of give you an example here because sometimes it's easier to just look at these pictures. So let's look at this very first one. And so for the first one here, we have glycine first, and then we add alanine. And then what happens is you can see is that we've created glycine on the left of our polypeptide. They've come together to create this really unique component. So it's a carbon double bond to the oxygen with the NH group, very unique of a dipeptide, okay? And then on our right side, what we see is the alanine component, okay? And then, of course, we eliminate water because that's our condensation reaction. But the big thing I want to highlight is that our methane group is right here, and then our CH2 is right here. Okay, so that's a hydrogen. Now, let's look at adding of these in the opposite order. So instead, we're going to start with alanine, and then we're going to add glycine. So when we do this, instead of what we created the first time, this time around, we have our alanine on the left side. Then again, we have our unique component that makes it a dipeptide. And then on our right side, we have our glycine. Again, of course, we obviously have to eliminate water in order for it to be a condensation reaction. But what I want to point out is the difference here in this reaction. So what we are seeing now is that we have our hydrogen component here instead of a CH3 group, and then right here we have a CH3 group instead of a hydrogen. So even though these molecules look very, very, very similar, they are not the same thing. They are two completely different molecules. So the most important thing that we can remember for our polypeptides, our dipeptides, anytime we're trying to put amino acids together, is the order is very, very important. I'm going to leave you with that. Have a great week. Take care of yourself. Eat your veggies.